Fans are in disbelief after 76-year-old Ric Flair finally speaks out about Hulk Hogan's passing. This farewell isn't what everybody anticipated. No tactful remembrance, no well-planned nostalgia. Rather, Flair presents an unvarnished and intensely intimate reality that is causing division in the wrestling community. However, what really triggered everything was what he allegedly said in private. Are incensed, insiders are conversing, and the legacy of one of the greatest figures in wrestling feels more convoluted than before. Why now? Why this message too? The version of the narrative that no one else is willing to share is going to be told to you. Hogan's burden. Hulk Hogan didn't appear to be the towering figure that millions of people knew from the heyday of professional wrestling in the latter months of his life. He was no longer pumping the audiences or posing in the ring. The man who had once been praised as the strongest in the industry was gradually disintegrating behind closed doors. He was catching up on everything physically, emotionally, and spiritually. At age 71, more surgeries had been performed on Hogan than some hospitals perform in a week. His knees had been beaten, his shoulders rebuilt, both hips replaced, and his back had been opened up 11 times. Additionally, he had a critical neck treatment a few months before to his death, which left him with restricted mobility. Therapy, painkillers, and soreness weren't sporadic obstacles. They were part of his everyday life. Reports state that Hogan hardly ever voiced his grievances to the public. However, his closest friends and family saw a different side. He was worn out not in a superficial, everyday sense, but really and profoundly. According to friends, he had trouble getting out of seats on his own. He stopped going to a lot of wrestling events because it had become a nuisance to traverse a room, not because he didn't want to. Then there was leukemia, specifically chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Not many people knew about it. Hogan had kept it confidential, preferring to let the world remember the man in red and yellow, rather than the one who was silently fighting a sickness that was draining him in the background. He was not looking for pity. Pity was not what he wanted. However, he was aware that the end was drawing near. He spent the majority of his last days at home in Clearwater, Florida. According to reports, he refused to have any dramatic hospital stays. No drama, no press, just silence. However, such quiet did not imply tranquility. It meant being alone. A buddy characterized the past few weeks as eerie, not because of any noteworthy incidents, but rather because of how still everything had become. His last chapter was one of silence for a guy whose life had been characterized by clamor, booming arenas, applauding fans, and dramatic interviews. Perhaps the stillness, the absence, and the knowledge that the man who once personified American bravery, courage, and resiliency was gone were the things that grieved those who knew him the most. Now he could hardly raise his arms without flinching. Some claim that Hogan had accepted it, that he had anticipated it, and that he had decided to end things on his own terms rather than making them into a publicity circus. Some claim that he withdrew because he was unable to confront the shadow of the man he had become. The outcome was the same regardless of the cause. To the general public, the news of his passing was unexpected, but to those who knew him well, they had been watching the slow motion ending for months. He had a heart attack and died. However, that last second was merely the last fissure in a foundation that had been eroding for years. There were several ways in which his heart had been overburdened. The world's wrestling fans were in mourning. Social media was inundated with tributes. Celebrities told tales. Other wrestlers shared old pictures. It appeared that everyone had something to say. Ric Flair was one of them. Others, however, praised the legacy, although Flair's tone would soon change. Nobody anticipated what happened next. A history etched in perspiration and treachery. Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair had a relationship that was formed in the midst of wrestling's most brutal period. Long before tributes and headlines, their names were always close to each other. Flair was never far behind or ahead of Hogan wherever he went. They were more than just symbols. They were competitors, allies, rivals, and sometimes adversaries. Despite everything, they were able to understand one another in a manner that no one else could. Their feud predates both the intensity of WCW's Monday Nitro and the lights of WrestleMania. As the spokesperson for WWF in the 1980s, Hogan helped popularize professional wrestling. Meanwhile, Flair was ruling the NWA as the flamboyant technical genius, the man who stole the show without the need for finger-pointing or vivid colors. Flair was the antagonist. Hogan was a superhero, and the audience were enamored with both characters. The two didn't start interacting on a regular basis until the 1990s, when WCW took over. Although their battles were thrilling, the true drama took place behind the scenes. Insiders claim that Hogan's political scheming and inventive control provisions were a stark contrast to Flair's conventional outlook. At times, it almost tore the locker room apart, because they both wanted the attention. However, it was precisely this tension and friction that gave their rivalry its legendary status. Back then, neither man would ever openly acknowledge it. However, they pushed and lifted one another. And even though he left the stadium in a rage, he left in a better state than when he arrived. It wasn't all business, though. A deeper bond was developing behind the scenes. Ultimately, it would be their struggles rather than their personalities that would bring Flair and Hogan together. Both experienced financial difficulties at various times. Both faced the agonizing reality of their bodies failing after decades of punishment, as well as damaged families, public scrutiny, and health problems. Mutual abrasion has a strangely uplifting effect. Later on, Flair would acknowledge that Hogan had been more helpful to him than most people realized. Hogan occasionally provided him with cash, checked in with him when others didn't, and stood up for him when the media ignored him. There remained a thread that bound them together even when they weren't communicating much. Furthermore, that thread didn't actually break. However, it wasn't the tale of two closest friends going on retirement cruises together. Their connection was still erratic. In 1999, following a WCW incident that almost brought an end to their relationship, Flair and Hogan got into a real-life fight. Flair thought the way the game went was disrespectful. Hogan allegedly failed to recognize the problem. Time, as usual, smoothed the edges after tempers rose and voices were shouted. The tone changed in the last few years. Both of them had visible and invisible scars, were older, and were worn down. Hogan had mostly distanced himself from the conversely. Flair continued to be as vocal as ever, showing up at events, tweeting, and letting everyone know he was still alive and well. Even Flair, though, had begun to slow down, and that old fire appeared to go out, if only briefly, when word spread of Hogan's passing. Because this defeat was about history, rather than just a co-worker or fellow wrestler. Flair lost a mirror instead of a buddy, someone who embodied the positive and negative aspects of being in the spotlight. And that's why so many people were taken aback by what happened next. Flair didn't use well-chosen words or a neat tribute. He revealed decades of shared pain, pride, and history, along with unadulterated, uncensored emotion. He wasn't speaking on behalf of a company. He was speaking from the perspective of a man who had run out of people who genuinely knew what that life was all about. And when he eventually revealed himself, fans weren't prepared for that kind of message. The Survivor's paradox Ric Flair did not withdraw into quiet in the days after Hulk Hogan's death. He did not disappear from view. However, there was a change in him. He lacked the dazzling enthusiasm and confidence that fans had grown accustomed to. His eye still had some shine, but it was less intense. And according to those who know him the best, beneath the casual comments and public appearances was a guy struggling with survivor's guilt, a much more serious issue. Extremes have always been a part of Flair's personality. Extreme charisma, extreme confidence, extreme resilience, and extreme vulnerability. He has escaped death more times in his lifetime than most wrestlers have held the title. His back was broken in a plane crash in 1975. His career almost ended before it started. After experiencing multiple organ failure in 2017, he was put into a medically induced coma and given a 2% chance of life. He has been diagnosed with and recovered from skin cancer twice. He has outlived his family, friends, and even his own kid. As a result, when Hogan, who seemed to be a larger-than-life character who seemed to be impervious to time, passed away, it caught him off guard. Those close to him claim that he started to experience an emotional downward spiral, but it was private and not visible. Anxious tirades about age, legacy, and whether he had said what he needed to say were interspersed with extended periods of stillness. He allegedly told friends, "Why am I still here?" on multiple occasions, in utter disbelief, not in a self-pitying manner. Due to the fact that Hogan had become a recluse in his final years, due to discomfort and operations, Flair, who was 5 years older, was still in good physical health. He mentioned no chronic diseases or aches. It startled him and was confusing. A peculiar imbalance was produced by the juxtaposition between the spooky life of one emblem and the physical deterioration of another. It was incomprehensible to Flair. He started thinking about Hogan's suffering in public, not only the physical one, but also the psychological one brought on by witnessing his body disintegrate, even though everyone thought he would still be the Hulkster. In interviews, Flair talked about how difficult it had become for Hogan to walk, move, and lead a regular life. Nevertheless, Hogan never sought pity. Even in his latter days, he picked dignity above show. That insight sent Flair off, causing him to feel the need to talk and face not only Hogan's passing, but also everything it stood for: time, regret, legacy, and what it's like to outlast your peers when your whole identity was based on them. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that his final message would evoke strong feelings. The way he spoke, however, shocked many more than the fact that he spoke at all. The edges were not smoothed by a publicist or filter. Whether or not fans were prepared for it, this was a man sharing his opinions. It wasn't a press release, and that unwavering honesty, the foundation of all that came after, was rough and derived from decades of shared history. Because Flair spoke the truth as he perceived it, he did more than simply pay respects. And he started a firestorm in the process, shattering the quiet. There was no grandiose announcement, no spectacular comeback to the limelight. For the first time since Hogan's death, Flair just talked in public. His message was succinct, yet unambiguous. I believe he simply became weary. 2 hip replacements, 11 back procedures, and a neck operation. How much can your body handle, really? He didn't make it dramatic. He didn't make things up. His speech carried a tone of resignation, the kind of fatigue that only comes from witnessing a loved one gradually decline over time. Additionally, Flair included something that drew in a lot of viewers. Even though I'm 5 years older than Hulk, I don't feel any pain or aches. I find that upsetting, and naturally, it makes me nervous that I might be the next. His public comments elicited a mixed response, but no uproar. The statement was deemed respectful, if not heartbreaking, by many supporters. They valued the humanity and honesty. Flair wasn't on stage, speaking as a man who had witnessed too many of his friends pass away too soon, rather than as a showman. He was thinking. That was just the surface, though. There was more to what Flair had been saying in private, behind closed doors, in conversations that weren't intended for the cameras, according to people close to him. And everything changed when those words started to circulate online. I can't keep quiet any longer. Before making his public remarks, Flair allegedly told a longtime buddy, "People keep acting like Hogan went out on a high note. He didn't. He was wretched. He detested being perceived in that manner, unable to walk, unable to move. He didn't want to be remembered that way." The comments quickly went viral. Yes, Ric Flair finally spoke up about Hulk Hogan's passing at the age of 76, but his remarks infuriated many. It was more than simply an observation to a lot of admirers. It was a stomach punch. It felt like a betrayal of the hero they looked up to when Flair said that Hogan was ashamed of his condition. They didn't want to see the picture of vulnerability it presented. The picture of the man who once advised millions to eat their vitamins and say their prayers, then body slammed giants, contrasted violently with this. A few fans reacted angrily. Discussions on social media became heated. There was a lot of discussion on wrestling boards. How dare he say it on Hogan's behalf? I read one post. Instead of changing the conclusion, he should be paying tribute to his friend. Others charged Flair with fabricating Hogan's death to suit his own interests, turning sorrow into criticism that wasn't his. However, there was another aspect as well. An increasing number of voices supported Flair, claiming that the guy who had known Hogan for more than 40 years, both inside and outside the ring, had earned the right to speak candidly. They saw Flair's leaked remarks as honest rather than insulting. Yes, uncomfortable, but grounded in reality. Flair hadn't destroyed Hogan's legend after all. He had lamented the silent agony of a man who lived out his last years in agony and out of sight, away from the spotlight that had once characterized him. "I can't keep quiet anymore" became a phrase that took on a life of its own. Some thought it was superfluous. Some thought it was courageous. Whatever the viewpoint, it created a maelstrom that Flair made no effort to quell. Ric Flair did not break his silence at the age of 76 with a tribute that flawlessly recapped Hogan's memories. He was honest when he broke it, perhaps too much of it, and the message was clear regardless of whether fans felt seen or deceived. Men coping with suffering, fear, and dwindling legacies lived behind the legends and the fantastical characters. Not everybody was prepared to deal with that, battling the consequences. Ric Flair's comments regarding Hulk Hogan did not elicit a particularly strong reaction. No sensational headlines, viral indignation, or concerted backlash were present. That was not the case. However, it caused a great deal of unease in the wrestling world. The circles that actually watched these men and were aware of their pasts. Not because of Flair's public remarks, but rather because of the rumors that circulated later. Flair had made a measured, even courteous, formal statement. He discussed Hogan's suffering, his surgeries, and his fortitude. He thought about how odd it was to still be physically POW his lifelong acquaintance had suffered in his last years. It seemed vulnerable and sincere. That was appreciated by most fans. However, when rumors about Flair's private comments started to circulate, the unease increased. According to reports, he said to a friend, "I can't stay silent anymore," and then something more direct. People continued to act as though Hogan won. He didn't. He detested being perceived in that manner. He was truly broken by that. It was never cited in print. Although it didn't make the news, it was enough that individuals in the wrestling community were discussing it cautiously and privately. Some believed Flair had gone too far, not because his statements were untrue, but more because Hogan never made the decision to speak them himself. Hogan wouldn't have included that in his account if he had been embarrassed by his appearance toward the end and had opted to hide rather than go on display. It was something he had never asked anyone to explain. Despite having the greatest of intentions, Flair's choice to fill in that blank caused discomfort for others. Others were fully aware of Flair's perspective. They had witnessed the same events. During his last year, Hogan had declined appearances. He stayed away from cameras. Even if it meant losing his job, he opted for privacy. He was not looking for pity. He wished to maintain the perception that people still held of him as the powerful, arrogant, and unstoppable force. That image remained intact despite Flair's remarks. However, they gave it a genuine element that many people weren't prepared to face. In actuality, there was never going to be a flawless way to discuss what transpired with Hulk Hogan in his latter years. His physical deterioration hurt. Despite his severe health problems, he remained silent. His death felt abrupt, even though it wasn't, since he didn't want the world to witness his pain. Flair's decision to discuss that quiet and even subtly violate it caused discomfort to others. He was not malevolent. He wasn't mean. He was straightforward, though. And when it comes to their heroes, wrestling fans sometimes struggle to comprehend it. They remember the entrances, the promos, and the slams. They are accustomed to the legend, not the guy. Sometimes they don't want to hear about the solitude, the hospital beds, or how someone gradually loses their fame. Flair made no attempt to alter Hogan's narrative. He only included a chapter that most fans had not read. It was significant, even if it didn't match the overall story. Even while it didn't spark a blaze, it gave people a more profound grasp of what aging in this industry actually entails. Flair's words caused wrestlers to pause and think. There were no interviews or statements, just casual remarks, nods, and a few texts between veterans who understood exactly what he meant. Others had experienced it. They were afraid they would experience it themselves. Something had changed, yet no one yelled Ric Flair down. The discourse around Hogan's last years was less pristine than it always was. Even though it wasn't welcomed, it had been moved by something sincere. And that, the fact that wouldn't remain hidden, was the point for Flair. Ric Flair provided no explanations in the days that followed. He didn't retract his statements. He didn't make a follow-up statement or refute the private quotation that had gradually crept into the collective consciousness of the wrestling community. Rather, he stayed silent, not in retreat, but rather in a state of acceptance. More significantly, what he had stated was something he felt had to be spoken and was already in the public domain. The passing of Hulk Hogan meant more to Flair than simply losing a friend. A chapter in wrestling history came to an end, one for which there were few remaining voices. The majority of the famous people who had traversed those harsh circuits, who fashioned their bodies into machines and then destroyed them for amusement, were either deceased or had lost their ability to communicate. Despite everything, Flair managed to stay upright, alert, and able to recall the true cost of everything. His words were unique because of this. They weren't elegant, joyous remembrances intended to please the masses. They came from a man who had outlived the image, who had lived it, and who had seen things that the spotlight doesn't show. Flair wasn't attempting to downplay Hogan's legacy when he added, "I think he just got tired." He attempted to describe the toll. Furthermore, he wasn't judgmental when he stated in private that he didn't want to be perceived in that way. It was acknowledged. Flair has seen others with that similar expression. When a guy who once ruled the globe now hesitated to unlock the front door, he knew what it meant. Hogan wasn't being portrayed as weak by him. He was telling people that even when your entire existence has been based on the thunderous roar of the crowd, there are times when being strong, truly strong, means choosing to remain silent. The ache persisted, though, because Flair had made it clear, whether on purpose or not, that wrestling doesn't often let its heroes age well. When they are at their best, it demands everything of them, and when their bodies stop cooperating, it frequently abandons them. Furthermore, it's simpler to believe that those same heroes are just sleeping rather than quietly suffering when they fade from the public eye. Flair was aware of that. He had experienced both sides. He had been in the lead. He had lost everything. He would return. In addition, he had buried more friends than he wanted to remember. There is a cost to that kind of survival, one that is impervious to delusions. There are still fans who wish he hadn't revealed some things. Perhaps Hogan would have liked that as well. Quietness, however, is something Flair never was. And perhaps that was the idea after all. The conclusion doesn't always look like the movies, and sometimes our strongest heroes pass away quietly, not with a final match, but with a closed door and too much suffering to describe. But someone had to express what others were too scared to acknowledge. Flair didn't mean to offend. He couldn't bear it any longer, so he said it. Even while that truth was unsettling, it created room for introspection. Something wrestling seldom does. The sort that asks us what we owe the people who gave us their bodies, their health, and ultimately, their peace, not the kind that is centered on highlights or title belts. In memory, the red and yellow will never fade. But the truth is that even legends get weary, and perhaps that is also worth remembering. How do you feel about the confession made by Ric Flair? Tell us in the comments section.